Hey there, welcome to another Path of Exile guide. It's a new episode of scrambling to find a good League Starter build, the Spring Edition. Well, I'm here to help you with that and throw a few more options into the ring so you can really feel that, oh shit, what am I gonna play panic. But really now, having extra choices is a good thing, even if only as a backup if your first pick turns out badly. So, for each of these builds, I went over the passive tree, including the act-by-act leveling trees, adjusted the leveling skills, cluster jewels, items, and endgame gen setups, wherever such changes were necessary. Now, for the majority of builds and skills out there, literally nothing changed in practice going from 3.16 to 3.17. If you look at a skill like Arc, for example, sure, it will receive some major buffs in the new league, but that doesn't really require any actual changes. At most, swapping one support gem for another, but such builds will remain identical to their 3.16 form. They will just deal more damage, but that's about it. That being said, I do plan on remaking some of the older, very successful builds that I put out several leagues ago, like Arc Witch or Phantasm Necro. Now, in all fairness, however, if you've played either of those in 3.16 and you want to play them again in 3.17, they will work just fine. Anyway, let's get you started with numero uno, the fresh out of the oven Cyclone Slayer. Now this build really checks all the boxes for a great league starter. It doesn't require any mandatory uniques and the few best and slot ones are pretty common or easy to target farm, so this should work totally fine in SSF as well. It doesn't rely on mechanics that only come online once you reach endgame or buy certain items. It's really beginner friendly as it doesn't use any unintuitive combos or interactions, just plain old spin to win. And it has a smooth and constant gear progression curve. Basically, if you follow the gearing advice from the full guide, then no matter what your budget is, the build will perform proportionally with the investment. There's no "you must be this rich to play this build" entry barrier. However, keep in mind that this goes both ways, so you can't just drop 50 chaos on this and expect to wipe the floor with the new bosses. Be realistic and you won't be disappointed. The Slayer Ascendancy is also very well balanced with a great mix of bonuses for map clearing and bossing and decent defensive layers, so you won't need to roll a second character to farm a certain type of content. The build makes for extremely good long-term projects as well, a character you can play for the entire league and keep upgrading. Leveling up the Cyclone Slayer is a very smooth process. Just use the skill setups I've listed in POB, grab a few early auras like Precision and War Banner, low level Clarity to help out with mana sustain, and do your best to upgrade your weapon every 5 or 10 levels or so. The weapon will always remain your top priority, and even when you're deep into the Atlas. The difference between a 400 physical DPS staff and a 500 DPS one with some crit is absolutely huge. My second recommendation is a tanking beast, the Poisonous Concoction Champion. I was absolutely stunned to see exactly 0 nerfs to any of the various defensive layers this build uses. Pretty much everyone predicted either the Champion Ascendancy getting nuked or Determination or Spell Suppression. They all remain unchanged, so this might be the last chance you can get to play this in its original non-nerfed form. All that extra tankiness and defenses can act as sort of training wheels, allowing you to make additional mistakes without being immediately punished, which is especially valuable if you're a new player or more of a beginner. Now, leveling up with this build will almost feel like cheating, as the vast majority of your damage comes from gem levels and passives rather than items. In fact, you can have literally 0 damage mods on your gear from level 1 until you reach the Atlas, and you'll still have no issues whatsoever. And since the build doesn't even use a weapon, as Poisonous Concoction is an unarmed skill, you can save quite a bit of currency and use it for other items. To be fair, even the top tier best in slot recommended gear is actually quite cheap, as the build was designed to be a budget option for more casual players. For the same reason, however, you shouldn't expect it to be an amazing boss killer. The skill itself doesn't lend itself well to that, and damage scaling beyond a certain point becomes too expensive to be worth the investment. On the other hand, I'm fairly certain that with a few adjustments you could actually play this build in hardcore quite comfortably. If you've always wanted to give that a try, this could be a pretty good option. Third in line is General's Cry Shield Crush, a more tanky form of the Spin Boy. It's an incredibly easy to play build with great real applied damage that doesn't require targeting or any sort of setting up. You just spin around and mash the Warcry button and your Mirage Warriors will do the rest. This gives you the freedom to focus entirely on keeping your character alive and moving out of nasty stuff in boss fights. And if you're a new player or less experienced, that's a huge advantage as you can actually start learning the boss moves and mechanics this way. Now, this build can go way beyond the League Starter phase and well into the end game as you keep upgrading its gear. It has a very high ceiling and I've used it to run most of the high tier content. I've also recently updated this build's POB with a new leveling gem setups for a smoother progression. Using an early combo of Ground Slam and Earth Shatter plus Earthbreaker totem setup, along with a beefy two-handed axe, mace or staff, will have you breeze through the first half of the campaign. Even though you get Shield Crush at level 1, its damage scales with your shield and shields that early are pretty bad. Once you do transition to General Scry plus Shield Crush, the number 0 priority is to get a shield that has as much armor or evasion as possible. Everything else on it is secondary because that will basically be your weapon. Also keep in mind you need corpses to spawn your red boys, and before getting your Cyclone and Casual Channeling setup going, you can manually cast Desecrate for that. However, it's probably best to wait until you can get the full setup going. Then there are a couple of other tools that will make your life easier, especially once you start spinning. First, Quicksilver Flask to offset the movement speed reduction. You get 2 of these from the quests in Act 1 and 2. Then movement speed boots and at least a mana flask. If you can find an enduring mana flask, then you're golden. It doesn't even matter how much it recovers. You can also use a low level clarity aura. If you still find you're struggling with mana, then grab the Mana Leech node below the Val Pact keystone and that should do the trick. You can respec those points later on. Fourth on the list, Viper Strike, Pathfinder. So Viper Strike is one of those old school skills that was made for single target, but when using it with Melee Splash and Ancestral Call supports, it turns into a very respectable area of effectability. You get Viper Strike at level 1 and just like the majority of chaos damage skills in the game, it gets most of its damage from gem levels and passives rather than gear. This makes it ideal in a new league scenario as you can save up your currency for upgrades once you get to the Atlas. Even then, there is very little competition for the items you'll need in this build. Almost nobody uses clothes and most of the best in slot items are fairly common ones. You can easily kill stuff like Shaper, Elder, Conquerors, even good old Cirrus with 2 Wasp Nest Claws as your weapons, and those usually cost only a few Chaos Orbs. The playstyle is also very simple without any complicated combos or gimmicks. You hit stuff and watch it melt in a glorious green cloud. Anything that survives your initial hits will receive additional poison stacks from each nearby enemy that died. The Pathfinder is also very versatile and popular ascendancy, so you can even pivot to another build later in the league if you feel like switching gears. To summarize, very cheap and easy to play, not really gear dependent and without mandatory uniques. The main skill is usable from level 1 and is very well balanced both for map clearing and bossing. Anyway, if this sounds like what you're looking for, then check out the full guide by following the link in the pinned comment and video description. My final build suggestion for a league starter is the Skeleton Mage Necromancer, which remained completely unchanged from 3.16. There were no real nerfs or buffs to skeletons, necromancers or even minions in general. Well, okay, maybe the small quality of life improvement of having Desecrate behave more like a Spectre Bank. But apart from that, if you've played the build in Scourge League, then you should expect quite similar power levels. Gearing up, however, will be somewhat easier thanks to the new Eldritch crafting. Even if those won't be able to roll any minion nodes, you can just get defensive stats instead and take some pressure off the rest of your gear. Now, for people that aren't familiar with this build, the Skeleton Mage Necro summons an army of ranged skeletons along with a few other minions who are there to help them, basically a bunch of cheerleaders. What makes this build an amazing league starter is, first and foremost, its complete gear independence. Almost none of your minions' damage comes from equipment, and you don't need any expensive mandatory items which would be crucial for the build's performance. As long as your resistances are capped, you're good to go and your skeletons will obliterate everything in their path. Even the best in slot endgame gear usually costs less than what most builds need to clear white maps. Skeleton mages are obtained by socketing in a Dead Reckoning unique jewel, which transforms melee skellies into mages. While it is a very common and generally cheap jewel, you might not get it from literally day one of the new league. This build is usually quite popular as a league starter, so demand is also higher for the jewel. Expect prices to be fairly high in the first 3, 4, 5 days of the new league. That's absolutely no problem, however, as in early game and up to mid-tier maps, the normal melee skeletons are just as strong as mages, and you'll also find the melee skeletons gem setup in the Path of Building guide for the build. Now, the Skeleton Mage Necro is equally good at clearing large packs of mobs as well as killing bosses or other tough targets. Losing a few skeletons will never cripple you, as raising some more doesn't require corpses, so you can always go back to full strength in the middle of the fight. Not only that, but summoner builds in Path of Exile are a beginner's best friend. Similar to General's Cry, this build allows you to observe and learn difficult fights or a new league's mechanic while your minions do all the heavy lifting. And since we'll get quite a few new boss fights this time around, it's probably the perfect time to finally roll a summoner build.
Learn anything new, Exile?